Well, I've been asked to talk about space, and I assume it's because I was the only one that has done a non-government manned space program. It seems like yesterday that we did that, although it was 11 years ago that we flew 3 suborbital space flights without any help from my country, my government, without any help for NASA. It was done covertly. Most of our program we kept it in-house and didn't let anyone know what we were doing. So anyway, what I thought, and I've been asked to talk about the future of space, and I realized that most people are much younger than I am. I'm 72, and most people have forgotten what really happened in the inauguration of manned spaceflight in the 60s. So I'm going to start by going over a little bit of history and showing you how we got here, and then I'll talk as much as I can about the future. My government promised back in 1973, when the Apollo program was over, that my people were asking the government, well, when can we fly in space? When is it going to be for us? We are tired of listening to all these astronauts talk about how wonderful it is. We want to be immersed in it. And they told me, 30 years or so. Well, we ask again 30 years later, and the answer is the same. About 30 years. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. I only have about 30 years left, and are they going to say 30 years at that point? This is crazy. It's not working on it. No government is working on it. No government cares about private people flying in space, and they shouldn't work on it anyway. We had airliners 22 years after the first powered flight. Spaceships, it's going to be at least 60 years. And I don't think there's a good reason that it's still stagnant, and the big question is out there, when is it going to happen? So let's look a little bit about the history. I'm going to talk about this from the prospect or from the view of a United States citizen, an American. Our country suffered big losses at Sputnik, and when Yuri Gagarin flew. It was a big effect negative to our national prestige, how America was viewed from the rest of the world in terms of our technology and so on. Our response to that was absolutely unbelievable, and I'm going to cover a little bit about this because people don't remember the 60s. If you study it, you get little pieces of it, but what I'm going to do is throw it all together. It was a wild ride, a very successful for America to recover its national prestige. The next decade, in the 70s, we should have been out there solving the problem of why it's dangerous and why it's not affordable for the public. No work was done on that. We abandoned the capability to go to the moon. We built a space shuttle, which was really a space station. The space shuttle is a space station that has to be deorbited every couple of weeks. Senseless. A big mistake, and there was a bigger mistake, and that is the Russians copied it. We tell a joke in America that that's what brought down the Soviet Union, is they tried to copy the space shuttle. That's a joke. The last 3 decades after that, we ignored it. We ignored trying to develop a safe manned orbital system. We lacked the courage to try new stuff. We got chicken. Right here in one chart are 9 manned space launch systems. They're all independent, they're all different. 9 of them were done in 9 years. What have we done in the last 9 years? People, you know, historians don't know all of these. I'm going to go through them very quick. Of course, Vostok, Yuri Gagarin. We Americans responded in several weeks with Redstone Mercury, suborbital. That rocket was only that big around. Then, of course, John Glenn was flown in the Atlas so that we joined the community of orbital astronauts, cosmonauts. The next one was the X-15, which flew suborbital flights, 2 of them in 1963, above 100 kilometers. Then America did, as a stepping stone to the moon, we had already had our marching orders from JFK, we got to go to the moon before 1970. Wow. That was pretty crazy. I'm sure the Russians thought we were crazy. We did too. The Gemini was launched on a Titan, an ICBM. You know, the Vostok, the Redstone, the Atlas, the Titan. These were all these were designed to hit each other with nuclear warheads. And that's what we're using. The Russians beat us really bad the first few years, mainly because we had lighter weight nuclear warheads, and the Russians didn't, so they had to have bigger rockets, which gave Russia a very big lead in the early 60s and mid-60s. And then, of course, Soyuz, which is still being flown today. We got von Braun. I know you guys got some Germans too, but we got von Braun, and he was working already on the Saturn I. He had plans for a Saturn II, III, IV, and V. And when JFK got up there and said, our goal is to send men to the moon and bring them back safely to Earth, he got his people together and he says, we can't do a Saturn II or III or IV. We've got to work immediately on the Saturn V, and that's what happened. The last one on the list of 9, no one ever thinks about it as a manned space launch system. But in 1969, it flew 2 flights to launch 2 astronauts to space. And it's the ascent stage of the lunar lander. That is a manned space launch system, and nobody ever includes it on their list. And yet I think it was the most impressive one, because look at how many people it takes to launch men into space. These guys had to do their own ground checkout. Okay, the next 45 years, from 1970 until now, it's 45 years. How many new manned space launch systems have been developed? There's only 3. America did this space shuttle. The Chinese, Long March, Shenzhou, and my little program done with a few dozen people covertly in a hangar at Mojave did a suborbital space program. These are the only ones that were developed in that next 45 years. How many here were born before 1935? Is there no one here that's born before 1935? Aren't you embarrassed? No one born after 1935 has walked on the moon. What? If you had told us that in 1969, when we had men on the moon, that in 2015, only people older than this entire audience would have that wonderful experience that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong had, you'd have said, what happened? Did we go back to the caves and just now come back out? It's senseless. It's senseless. And look at this chart. We're within a few years of having no one on the earth that's ever walked on the moon, unless they speak Chinese. Okay, the first 10 years was pretty wild, and I want to point out some interesting things there. America, in response to Yuri Gagarin's flight with Vostok. Von Braun brought out of the hangar hardware he already had, and we flew Alan Shepard on a suborbital flight. Big deal. Suborbital flight. 10 years later, less than 10 years later, that same astronaut, Alan Shepard, was hitting golf balls on the moon. He was playing golf on the moon 10 years later. What have we done in the last 10 years? Why aren't we putting ourselves a challenge? If we did that in the 60s, before computers and the internet, why aren't we challenging ourselves now? It's crazy. The next 10 years after that, there were a lot of planetary missions. A lot of these were unsuccessful, but there were I'm talking about world now, not America. There were 4.6 per year robotic probes sent to planets. There, of course, was the finish of Apollo, the Skylab, which is the largest space station in terms of a room that you can bounce around in, and, of course, Salyut. And the space shuttle made its first flight exactly 10 years after Alan Shepard played golf on the moon. Now, here is the promise that we're going to have now low-cost space access because it's reusable, right? Duh. Well, boy, did we sure miss the ball on that. Actually, the space shuttle ended up costing 10 times as much to go to space as when we were throwing boosters away every flight. Okay, let's look at the next 3.4 decades. In other words, bring it all the way to now. Not just 10 years later, but this whole time period where you would think there would be a growth in activity. Look at all the enablers that we had for that, the computers, the software, the wonderful sensors, and so on. There were only 2 planetary missions per year flown in that whole time period on the average. Only about 35 or 40% of the planetary exploration that went on between 71 and 81. It makes no sense. We should be sending hundreds and thousands out to the planets every year, shouldn't we? Couldn't we? Of course we could. Oh, by the way, I'm not really proud of this. The first year, 1961, there were 4 manned space flights. In the year following the April flight of Yuri Gagarin, there were 5 manned space flights in the world. In 2004, how many manned space flights were there? Same number. Can you think of something, a capability that was first launched and then that long afterwards, and it's the same number of flights per year? And the crazy thing about it, again, I'm not proud of this, but I had to fly 3 of them with my little spaceship. Isn't that awful? We should be ashamed. The world should be ashamed that we're not doing anything. Well, that first 43 years, up to when I did Spaceship One, the government political justification was, were the justification for every manned space flight. You have to try nonsensical things to have breakthroughs, and that looks risky, and governments in general won't take a risk. That's why 50 years later, Soyuz is still being flown. You know, it's risky to try something really different. There was a belief that only governments can do it. The total activity was absolutely tiny. There's only 112 pilots of manned space flights in that entire first 43 years. That's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. It's nothing. The second 20 of those 40 years, the safety record was worse. The safety record got worse in the second 20 of 40 years, thanks to those 2 flights with a shuttle that kills 7 people each. First of all, space flight, manned space flight is primitive. Don't believe anybody that tells you anything different. It's still, today, primitive. We retreated to low Earth orbit. We abandoned lunar. There is no current USA capability to send anyone to space. Even my little suborbital ship is in the Air and Space Museum. It's been there for 11 years. Isn't that embarrassing? The X Prize was supposed to have 27 competitors. One of them was Russian. Nobody else has built anything to do it. That's weird. That's really, really weird. What's going on? You guys need to get to work, don't you? Manned spaceflight overall safety record is 4% of the people that have flown to space have died on their flight. Now, that's only 4 accidents, but it's 4%. You can't run an airline killing 4% of your customers, can you? It's the same safety record that we had in 1910 with airplanes. What we need is the environment that existed in 1909 with aircraft. Entrepreneurs in competition for market share. There were 139 countries flying airplanes in 1912. 139 countries flying. That was before the internet. How did they know? We need to have the courage to try new things that may not work. In fact, it's usually, if you look at a breakthrough and can call what you're doing research, half the people have to conclude before it's recognized as a breakthrough that that's nonsense. So if you're going to have a breakthrough, you better have confidence in nonsense. That's why weird folk like me try risky stuff. Okay, let me go over very quickly the Spaceship One program that flew those 3 space flights in 2004, 11 years ago. The view is very similar. The goal is to stimulate a private space flight industry so others can enjoy that view. I make the conclusion right now that it's probably, we probably have the technology to fly the public to space if we do suborbital flights. We do not yet have the breakthroughs that are needed to make it affordable enough and safe enough to fly the public to orbit. Well, the decision to do that was based on the fact when I was a kid, I saw all of this happen in the 60s. So being immersed in that as a child, it was easy for me to make a decision that, yeah, that's crazy to try to do something way out of what I've done before. The fastest airplane I developed, and I've done 46 airplanes. I'll be flying first flight on my 47th airplane within the next couple of weeks. I've done all those airplanes, but the fastest one was 0.77 Mach number. I did a business jet. Spaceship One, I had to go straight up at Mach 3.5. Was I afraid of that? I think not, because I saw what happened in the 60s. The billionaires that are putting money into new space now, I believe the reason that they're doing it is they were little kids during Yuri Gagarin's flight and during Apollo. And they saw this wonderful stuff that happened so quick. They know that it's possible, whereas our governments don't think it's possible because they won't take the risks with taxpayers' money. Okay, real quick on Spaceship One, I show this, our handsome test pilots. Our launch airplane, this was much like the X-15 program, which was an X-15 launched by a B-52. Well, this program, we had to build our own B-52. It was called White Knight. It had all of the identical systems except the rocket propulsion that Spaceship One had. The Spaceship is actually a very simple light general aviation airplane. Mechanical controls, it didn't even have a yaw damper. It was all hand-flown. It feathered itself for re-entry. And that was a breakthrough that I think will enable private spaceflight because it doesn't depend on carefully aligning angle of attack and side slip before, during re-entry in order to have a safe re-entry. Spaceflight really is too dangerous. All of manned spaceflight, there's been an accident about 1 every 65 or 70 flights. You can't run an airline having that kind of an accident rate. The very first airliners in 1927 and 28, there was an accident every 5,000 flights. Very soon after that, it moved up to 31,000. But for people to accept and demand that a space flight for the public be as safe as the modern airliners, which kill someone about every 6 million flights, okay? Don't recall, if you have a child and you let him ride in the family car for 17 years before he gets out, you have a 1 chance in 800 of killing him yourself in the family car. So we're used to big risks. I think a logical goal for a new space line is to have the same safety as they had in the early airliners. In other words, an accident every 6,000 flights. Okay, is it enabled? Maybe. My company, I'm retired now, but my company is still working on Spaceship Two, which is Richard Branson's plan for space tourism. Just a shot of what Spaceship Two looks like. I don't have time to go into details. I don't know when it will be certified to fly the public. It's been delayed a lot. Orbital has got to have breakthroughs in order to make it affordable enough and safe enough. But I think when it does, my vision for that is not just one big resort hotel in orbit, but 2 of them. Close together, one rotates, so you can spend the first few days at 0.1 G, 0.2 Gs, and then with no energy to speak of, you move over to 0 Gs and spend the rest of your vacation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for a fantastic speech. And I'd like to ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. You have done a lot for aerospace industry, and you are a real rock star in this industry. And what are you doing now, and what about your plans? What
am I doing now? I thought I could retire, and I was wrong. I've been a failure at retirement.
But I'm sure
I've built, and I'm in flight test now with an exploration airplane that it can operate from snow, grass, water, runways, anything, and could actually saltwater compatible. It can go into beaches and has the range to cross oceans. So that airplane will make its first flight in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, I have no doubt that you will do a lot of new things, and we all wish you all the best and good luck. And thank you again for a brilliant speech.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bert.